All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth week of Children's Literature, LCRT 5795. So here we are. We are in the fourth week. It seems like it's gone really fast. And this week we have such great books to read, such an interesting topic to consider. Our focus this week is cultural authenticity. We have 3 anchor books, 2 choice books, and the read aloud book for us to consider relevant to cultural authenticity. And I also encourage you to think back on some of the other books that we've read during the 4 weeks as you think about cultural authenticity. Certainly, several of them are relevant. So let me start with a quick review of week 3, and then I will go on to a preview of week 4. So obviously we talked about critical literacy and reading from a critical stance. It's really moving beyond the literal level to think about the function or the purpose of the text. It's reading the world, it's reading between the lines. If you want to think about Paulo Freire's work, but it's really looking beyond what's in the text and thinking about what's the purpose of the text, what's the message of the author, and even more than that. So questions that are asked are such as, whose voice is represented, whose voice is missing, whose voices are silenced or discounted. Maybe they're there, but they're not really given full presence. Whose viewpoint is expressed? And of course, the flip side, whose viewpoint is not expressed? And how might the same situation or problem that's presented in the text change if it were viewed from a different perspective? So there's 4 dimensions around critical literacy. You read about these. One is point of view, and many of you really highlighted this in your note catchers. So thinking about voices and voices that are presented, voices that are missing, in particular around Last Stop on Market Street. So that was a topic many of you addressed. You also talked quite a bit about how the reader is exposed to multiple points of views, different views of life, a range of individuals on the bus. So through each individual, we really got to view a variety of reactions to some of the same events and the same situations. Another dimension of critical literacy is social and political issues. And this really involves going beyond the personal level to considering what are the social and the political systems or issues that are being presented in the text, either directly or indirectly. And certainly Last Stop on Market Street prompts the reader to use literacy to engage in daily society and politics. And some of you brought this up, thinking about who's riding the bus, who's riding in cars, where are the people headed riding the bus, what happens at the end of the book, and where are they actually going to that soup kitchen, and who's serving. So there's some really interesting things to consider related to existing power relations, unequal power relations, things like that. So before we look at the last 2 dimensions, there's a couple of things I want to really draw out from the readings, and that is the implications around text selection. So teachers can really, obviously, think about the text selection in order to engage students in conversations around value systems, interests, power, privilege, even in a simple picture book. The discussion may be really geared for younger learners, so there's some things that you won't go into depth around, but certainly as younger learners read or are read to Last Stop on Market Street, there are things they're going to notice around power, privilege, and value systems. Teachers can engage students in conversations about how knowledge is constructed and about what makes a text believable. And I think Trombone Shorty is a great example here. Many of you brought out the language, the slang. I brought out the dialect from New Orleans quite a bit. That's the vernacular that's in many cases is silenced, but not in this book. It's really celebrated, and that's important. Important to point out, important to notice, important to realize it wasn't censored. wasn't left out of the book. Children need to be exposed to texts that examine dominant value systems and provide counter histories and counter narratives. Now, with younger children, we might not use those words, but the whole idea of allowing them, presenting them with scenes and characters that they might normally not see in a book. Pink and Say, if you know that book by Patricia Polacco, is a great example. It's really a counter-narrative to the war and presents some very interesting and kind of counter-histories for us to consider. The other thing is that young readers need to read texts that are culturally affirming, culturally relevant, culturally responsive. And for some, this might be We're Going to Be All Right, which is the read aloud coming up for week 4. It might be The Distance Between Us. It might be Trombone Shorty. But it's an interesting concept to consider that whether or not the books we select for our readers actually provide them with a reflection of who they are and their lives. Okay, so the remaining 2 dimensions of critical literacy, very quickly. One is to disrupt the commonplace. And in a lot of ways, I think that Last Stop on Market Street does do that. It really kind of disrupts what we might predict. And it really prompts us to ask some questions or start to wonder about some things. The 4th dimension of critical literacy is to promote social justice and to take action. And so that is really to do more than ask questions, do more than disrupt the commonplace, but really address some issues in contemporary life, injustices. And you can think about some other books we have read that do the same thing. So I bring up an example because we might wonder, well, what kind of action could young readers really take? And this is an example I love. It's from the community where I live and where my daughter went to school, and it's actually from the K-5 where she went to school, but there was a group for kids called Niños de Paz, or Children of Peace. And so they met after school, they read children's literature, they really came up with ideas of things they wanted to do to promote peace in the community. And so one winter, with a group of 1st and 2nd graders, the volunteer had read to them this short story about Dr. King. And the children got to talking about Dr. King. They learned about MLK marches that happen now. And they were really distraught to learn that the only MLK march in our area happened in Denver at that time. So the kids actually rallied, worked with the volunteer to scribe a letter to city council, went to a city council meeting, read their letter out loud, and presented a request, a plea for city council to initiate and pass approval on the small town of Lafayette having its very own MLK March. And that is in fact what happened about 12 years ago. And yes, it started small, about 50 people. And now each march in the last couple of years has been at about 500 people. It's also been turned over to the Lafayette Youth Advisory Committee. It's run by youth, and most of the performers and speakers are youth. So it's sort of mind-boggling how you actually can take action or prompt young learners, adolescent learners, to take action when a critical literacy perspective is taken. All right, let's see. Critical literacy needs to extend beyond what students actually read to what they know. And so there's this concept that students also need to gain power over the text that they create in their own writing. And so we're taking reading to writing. And certainly youth still require instruction and basic structure of the written language, vocab, grammar, etc. But this instruction can be situated within different contexts. And this may involve guiding students to write meaningful new media texts, as expressions of freedom, as celebrations of culture, and as contributing artifacts to the ongoing struggle for equality, humanity, and justice. So it's really taking their reading, linking it to their writing, and encouraging students to make their writing meaningful in a critical way. So we also read about modern fantasy. You know from your reading that there's some components of modern fantasy that include strong, believable characters. They examine issues of the human condition. They have a strong, credible plot. And they have strong elements that violate the natural physical laws of our known world. So in other words, there's that element of fantasy, of magic. Let's see, what else? We read about contemporary realistic fiction, and here's some of the characteristics of that type of genre. It tells a story that never happened, but could have. The story takes place in our contemporary world. The main character is relatable, believable, likable, and in many cases, we might be able to put ourselves in the book, or if not, we could certainly empathize with the main character. And generally, the storyline fits into one of these categories that you see here: sports, survival, adventure, animals, humor, mysteries, maybe problem novels. Okay, so we had a good time reading about that. Now we're going to take a look at week 4. So you can see the topics that we're addressing. We're actually going to start with them in the reverse order. Cultural authenticity. I love this. You'll know it when you see it. Most of the time we will. But as you'll learn from your readings, there's not always agreement on what the definition is. So here's a few definitions. The accuracy of the details of everyday life as represented in a children's book. Readers from the focus culture will know that it's true, they'll identify with it, and they'll be affirmed when reading the book. Readers from another culture will feel that the presentation is true, believable, they'll learn something about our similarities and differences. Okay, so those are a few of the definitions, but again, there's not always a lot of agreement. But there is a warning that a story can be accurate, but not authentic. So we need to beware of stereotypes, and we need to watch for overgeneralizations. All right, so there are 8 questions to consider around cultural authenticity. Here are 4 of them. Can outsiders write authentically about another culture? That's an interesting thing to consider. What are the author's intentions for writing the book? Does the author have a social responsibility for what he or she is writing? And what's more important, accuracy or authenticity? So you see the pondering here at the bottom of the slide. Who actually can write about the chain story? We're reading it. What do we think about a middle-aged white woman from New York writing it? It's interesting. Is it reasonable? Is it appropriate? Is it culturally authentic? That's something we need to think about this week. So here's a couple more questions. Is the book sensitive to the concerns of the focal culture? And what is the author's intention and social responsibility? I already mentioned that. Does the book pass critical scrutiny by cultural insiders? That's an interesting one to consider. So at issue is the potential abuse of privilege and potential misrepresentation of a culture by authors who are cultural outsiders. The caution and concern are that authors who are white European Americans may continue a subtle form of racism, intentionally or unintentionally, by benefiting from writing as a false cultural insider, especially if their book has some misrepresentations of a culture or of past events, or when the book presents a softer version of harsh historical events. And I bet we can each think of a book or 2 that we've read that might fit that concern. Also, cultural insiders are concerned about a cultural outsider interrupting their right to tell their own cultural stories as a way of passing on their culture to a younger generation. So these are some questions that are probably not easy answers, probably not answers, but very important for us to consider. So as we think about multicultural books, what are the advantages of reading and sharing multicultural books? You have several different perspectives to read regarding this question, but here are a few. So advantages are to nurture an awareness and appreciation of people whose lives are different from their own, provide a child with a reflection of his or her own cultural group, especially for a teacher who doesn't represent their cultural group, their racial group, their linguistic group. We can bring them a mirror of reflection through carefully selected books. All right, what else? We can affirm a positive representation of the children's cultural group. We can present and reflect the changes of the current context or era, including the harshness of a real life. You know, we've read about that, we've talked about that some. We can share books by excellent authors with children. So, multicultural books can address much more than cultural heritage. It's not just food and celebrations. Remember, and I think it's easy to forget this sometimes, that our heritage is much more, or I should say, let me put it in reverse, our culture is much more than our heritage. Our culture includes religion, race, socioeconomic background, the region we were raised, the region where we live, our gender, our ability, our sexual orientation, and more. And so really looking for books that cover a broad sense of culture is important. Why is there a need for multicultural books? Well, here's a few reasons. You'll read some more in the upcoming articles and chapters, but first off, to counter xenophobia, the mistrust or the fear of people who are strangers, to provide children who are part of cultural groups that are outside of the U.S. mainstream culture, and to give them a chance to see a positive reflection of themselves in school. Again, as I said, if you're not from the children's background, this is a great way to bring in positive representation and a reflection so they can see themselves in a book. There is a limited number of books about children of color, so that is another reason there's a need for it. And there's a limited number of books written by authors who are people of color from diverse backgrounds. All right, so there are, as I said, some more things for us to consider as we get into the readings this week. Okay, I'm going to move us forward. Poetry. Oh, you have some interesting exposure to poetry this week. And it's something I think some of us anyway may shy away from. But young children love to listen to and engage in various types of poetry, whether they're rhymes, songs, jingles, whether they're lyrics, limericks, rap, narrative, poems. You know, I bet a lot of you either read or read Where the Sidewalk Ends, and you may be familiar with the Ickle Me, Pickle Me, Tickle Me Too. It's just fun. And think of what's happening around letters, sounds, association between letters and sounds. It's an amazing phonemic awareness activity. You're going to see some really fun and very enlightening poetry video clips that come up this week. So please make sure you watch those videos. All right, chapter 17, we're moving right along. Teaching with children's literature. So this is something for us really to consider. What types of books are used to teach reading in the context where you are, or where you have a colleague who teaches? Ask, find out, talk to each other, and ask yourself, are trade books, meaning children's literature, used? Well, here's some of the strengths of children's literature, or what are often called trade books. An engaging writing style, rich language, providing a depth of content, and really bringing a subject to life. Providing current information, more up to date than the content that's presented in textbooks. Trade books are written to engage, to entertain, and to inform. And so sometimes they also offer a great option as a supplemental book. But again, let's come back to the question of what are children reading in school? Well, we know locally and across the country that there's a strong reliance on reading programs, basal reading materials, level books, and in reality, some children have very limited time with trade books actually in their hands, real children's literature in their hands. It seems odd, but true. The research shows that growing up in a home with lots of books was a predictor for children to complete high levels of schooling. And in a series of book access studies, findings indicated that in schools located in poor communities, children spent 1.9 minutes with informational books. 1.9 minutes. Wow. It's hard to fathom. The National Reading Council paper in 2001 emphasized the need for effective beginning reading instruction to include contextualized reading instruction that is flooded with literature. Not necessarily flooded with reading programs, but flooded with literature. Or coupled with literature, how about that? Using nonfiction informational trade books as well as fiction books to enhance content instruction provides depth and breadth and tends to really pique the learner's interests. And those of us who use children's literature know that. One children's book on a particular topic often leads to others, and often leads to nonfiction. So in conclusion, this actually concludes the mini lecture for week 4, and I will see you online. I'm looking forward to our interactions, to reading your note catchers, to hearing what you have to say around the topic this week of cultural authenticity. And then you'll see me again. There'll be a final post from me on Canvas at the close of the course. I'll have some concluding comments. So have a great week. I feel really confident you're going to enjoy these books. They're really enriching. And see you online.